What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Fighting Matters. I'm Jeff Shaw from Bellingham BJJ in lovely Bellingham, Washington. I'm joined, as usual, by my man, Mike Mahaffey. Mike, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey guys, I'm Mike Mahaffey, the shirtless one, the sleeveless one. Old Bastard BJJ is my handle. I'm out of Lansing, Michigan. I train at Magic Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Lansing.
And we have a guest today that I'm really excited about, that I've been corresponding with. I've read your work for quite some time. And Professor Janet O'Shea is not just an academic who's written, I thought, a really powerful book called Risk, Failure, Play, which we'll talk about today, but has also written a lot about the issues we talk about on this show, about violence versus fighting, about the rise of political fascism. And so, Jay, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. I've read a bunch of your work, and some of the stuff that one consistent theme in your work is the distinction between fighting and violence. And I'd love for you to tell us about that distinction in your eyes.
Sure, I'd love to. I'm very enthused about this topic. So I started thinking about it because for Risk, Failure, Play, I was thinking about not so much is sport fighting different from violence, but why it feels so profoundly different. And I think what was central about that was like understanding how important particular parameters are, and particularly how important consent is. And so I had been thinking through this idea about, and particularly thinking about Elaine Scarry's work, where she talks about what defines pain. One of the things that defines pain is the lack of consent. And I was sort of trying to work that through. And I was at this martial arts studies conference, and I met someone who became a really great colleague for me, Alex Channon. And he pointed me in the direction of sociological studies and said, oh, well, that distinction is actually, it's pretty well established in sociology that fighting is different from violence. And so sociologists have looked at mostly street fighting in terms of this distinction. And they talk about how if two people decide to get into an altercation, there's a lot of things that code it as consensual, like if I spill your drink in a bar, right? And you can turn around and confront me, and I could just say, hey, sorry, I'll buy you another drink. Or I could, hey, you want to make something of it? Oh yeah, what are you going to do about it, right? And so it's like coded. And so they looked at that and have said like, okay, well, that's different from violence, where the attempt is to actually eradicate somebody's will rather than engaging with somebody's will. And so I think even more so when we're looking at sport fighting, even if we're looking at kinds of sport fighting that are very intense, that have a great deal of fighting efficiency involved, they are still so clearly different from real world violence because they have set parameters. They have particular kinds of etiquette where we show that we're entering into this voluntarily. It's happens within a very particular setting on the mat, in the ring, in the cage. So I think I found all that really interesting, but then I also felt like with the sociological studies, maybe they weren't getting into the complexity of consent enough, because consent is crucially important here, but it's also complex. And maybe it's precisely because it's important that it is complex. So what about these situations where somebody is compelled to fight? Then it's we no longer have that clear distinction. And that could be things that are really horrific, like when cartels force migrants to fight each other. But it could also be things that are a little more subtle, like in working class, low income communities where somebody has to fight just to kind of keep their head up on the street, or sometimes even like kids at school. Like I remember, when I was in middle school, like you had to get into fights to prove yourself. And so there, then consent starts to get a little bit messy, and maybe the difference between fighting and violence gets blurred.
Yeah, let's explore this consent piece a little more. My students always hear me talk about how jiu-jitsu is a consent-based activity, and consent can be withdrawn. You talk in your book about the ways that consent can be contingent, and that each fight sport, and I know you've practiced a bunch of different martial arts, Muay Thai, jiu-jitsu among them, that there are specific and contingent ways that we establish consent. And I don't want to get us off on a tangent right away, but when you were talking, I thought about the recent incident with Rampage Jackson's son, Roger Jackson, which I don't know if you saw, Jay, but then I'll give you a preview, but then I want us to talk more broadly about consent, where he was supposed to participate in a professional wrestling event. It went wrong. He knocked a man unconscious and continued to beat him landing about 20 strikes after the guy was already unconscious. And what made me think of that is that, there are complex and ways in which consent can be presented and withdrawn. But one thing that's universal to me in most fight sports, at least in terms of etiquette as well as practice, is once the person is actually unconscious, consent cannot occur anymore. Right. And so that's one way. But like, can you talk a little bit more about like the ways we negotiate consent in some of the different martial spaces you've been in?
Sure. So, yeah, I think things like sometimes like looking at these examples of where it goes wrong um, are really interesting. Um, and I think sometimes people from outside of martial arts or people who are a little bit more skeptical of martial arts will often point to those exceptions to say, oh, but you see, it really is violent. But if martial arts were really just violence, then we wouldn't be talking about things like that. Right. Um, So the example I give in risk failure play, which is a little dated now, but is the Ronda Rousey refusing the handshake, right? And how like she was castigated for that. I was like, well, look, if it were the same thing as real violence, people wouldn't get so upset about that. But to refuse a handshake in martial arts is actually a really big deal because it does start to blur that line and it does start to mess with consent. And I think that that example you've just talked about, I mean, that's a classic example of a violation of consent, right? If somebody's unconscious. And it's kind of interesting that, the two arenas we should probably be like so meticulous about consent are fighting and sex. And those are the two things where we actually muck it up a lot. And where we actually have these ideas about like, oh, once you start, you can't get out and you have to see things through to completion, right? And like, yeah, that's such a perfect example of why consent is important. Like an unconscious person can't consent, right? Consent is negatively defined. You have to be able to withdraw it. So that's also why, like, for example, children can't consent, right? The children's consent is important, but legally they can't consent to things because they don't have the power to withdraw it. So that's super important. And it's super important when it comes to fight sports, that somebody be able to discontinue their participation at any time. And of course, that doesn't always play out, right? And there's all sorts of reasons why we might stay in a sport fight encounter, either because we're being pressured to, or because we don't want to let down our teammates, or maybe we're being paid, or maybe it's just inside our heads, right? That thing of like, I have to see this through to the end. So again, it's complicated, but it's also, to me, there's something so amazing about fight sports and about like even like modern hybrid sport fighting. We have all these etiquette markers that are set up to display our consent. You know, touching gloves, shaking hands, waiting for the ref, waiting for the coach to call something, stopping when the coach says to stop, right? Like all those things there are all sorts of ways of signaling that we have just entered into something voluntarily.
Yeah, in jujitsu,
And
I always
yeah,
think about the slap and the bump, right? Like we slap and bump.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And conversely, tap is a pretty good safe word,
No,
right?
absolutely.
Like, I think jujitsu is so clear like that, and that's something that I think is amazing about it.
One of the greatest drills, and like I promise I didn't plan to wear the amazing Possum Princess shirt today, but my buddy Cody Malte runs an amazing MMA school, Elevate MMA in Durham, North Carolina, and always he's very forward thinking in the way he teaches. And one of the drills that I've stolen from him is not a technique drill, it's not a sparring drill or anything like that. He actually has people drill saying no to spars and rolls just to send the message that like, and so you'll have 30 people in class, and he's like, all right, guys, go ask someone to spar, and they're going to say no. And it's one of those things that where it kind of normalizes, because you mentioned, consent. We would love it if everything was explicit and like, here's a clear line. Sometimes that's there, the tap, unconsciousness, but social pressure is real. And so sometimes that person who maybe is a little scared to roll with the 280-pound new guy does not feel empowered to say no unless it's normalized that, oh yeah, we do this all the time. And not only do we do this all the time, we practice doing this just to send the message you can withdraw consent at any time.
Yeah,
That's
which is so. Oh, Mike, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that's amazing because I think that's one of the things that about jiu-jitsu culture that I've seen that I don't necessarily agree with is this idea that you have to roll with everybody all the time, right? And I don't think it's ubiquitous throughout all of jiu-jitsu, but there are definitely pockets of, for lack of a better term, like macho-ness that, tells people that it's not okay to say no to a role. You're disappointing your training partners. You're limiting your own growth and development, and it's just not being tough. But I mean, I tell all of our students all the time that, like, it's your body. You've got a right to decide who gets to roll around with you on the mat for any reason, any day, anytime. You can say no. So I love that. Sorry, Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of just gonna say the same thing in a sense, because I think one of the things that as jujitsu people we really like is that idea of like jujitsu works on anybody, right? And and it's sort of to an extent like, yeah, it's kind of true. Like I am amazed at how accurate the belt system is, and a lot of other attributes are of reduced importance in comparison to how much skill you have. Um, and so we kind of like to be able to try that out. And then at the same time, though, there are some people, and it's not necessarily even the people you would expect, but like there's some people who are like, oh, that person's too intense, that person's too wild, that person's kind of awkward, moves in weird ways. And either I don't want to spar with them or I don't want to spar with them tonight. I've just had a long day, I'm not fully focused, all of those things. Like we should be able to be responsive. And it would be great if that were normalized. And then the other addendum I just add, addendum that I'm going to add, that's redundant. But another addendum to that is that it's hard to say no in general. Like that's something we practice in empowerment self-defense is just saying the words no, because we're taught that to be a good person, you have to say yes all the time. We're taught that to be strong means to say yes all the time or to be tough. Or as you were saying, Mike, like to even like we have to agree to everything to like support our own learning process. Oh, and that's not necessarily how we learn the best.
Right. I mean, I say no to roles all the time, and I feel like I need to model that for people too. And I don't think anybody is supporting their learning process if they're agreeing to a role that they spend most of their time worried about getting injured, or being afraid to try new things. So,
Right.
I love
Totally.
I love the way I came up, and I think there's a lot of really beautiful things about old school jujitsu and old school martial arts, and a lot of really powerful things that we need to keep and pass on. And as I always say, um, I don't regret a thing about the way that I came up in the martial arts, but it's not what I want for everybody, right? We get better, we learn, we incorporate insights from other people, we learn drills from people, we learn better ways to communicate. And Jay, I do want to talk about the state of play stuff that you talk about in this book, but like one of the stories that I remember most is I've trained at very forward thinking gyms and I've trained at really tough guy gyms. One time I was rolling with one of my beastly training partners getting ready, and it was one of those Shark Tank sort of situations where Jeff's getting ready for the competition. We're gonna really be rough on him, and I got moved awkwardly into a stack pass, and instead of getting folded like this, I got folded like this, and one of my ribs
Mm,
popped, and
mm,
which yeah, not a
yeah.
lot of fun. I see you both know what I'm talking about. Everybody who does jujitsu long enough, the ribs is a really common one, right? And so the thing is, so loud pop, everybody stops. And I've had several rib injuries. Some of them are super painful. Some of them, but you can move. Some of them are not painful at all, but they're very debilitating. It's a strange injury. So my coach comes over and we got like some frozen strawberries or whatever, and they put it on my rib. And I take about 30 seconds and he's like, "You okay?" And I say, "Yeah, I think I'm okay." He's like, "All right, well, it's time to finish this round." Instinctually, I put my mouth guard in and he says, "I was kidding." But because some of the experiences that I'd
Yeah.
had, it was just, and it wasn't my like reflective cognition because obviously he was kidding, but it was just like, well, I guess we're doing this. And that's the kind of thing that is not, there's a limit to everything, and toughness is valuable and perseverance is great. One of the great things about the martial arts is it teaches us to push through like very difficult things, but not injuries necessarily.
right.
Yeah.
I came up in striking for a long time, decades before I did jujitsu. I'm at this point in time, I'm about 20 years of each at this point in my life. And I came up in striking in like the 80s, late in the 80s through the 90s, and concussion protocol was not well known. And I remember, like, I was young and scrappy and competing all the time, and I remember people getting knocked out in practice, and then, they get up, you dust them off, they get back in the ring, and they do some more rounds. And that's, while in some sense, I'm like, well, and my friends that I used to train with in striking that I still talk with, we think, yeah, we learned really how to be tough, but we don't ever want to put people through that. That was, just stupidity. And the pressure to, like, just keep going despite those catastrophic head injuries was it was inappropriate,
I
to
think you
say the
mean
least.
I think you mean getting your bell rung. Concussion's such a serious word.
Right. Mm, I don't know.
Yeah.
No,
I was
like
in
that, but
tournament.
that's what they used to tell us is if you got a concussion, oh, you just got your bell rung, get back in there. It experience I oddly that happened to me more in non-combat sports than in other sports, but I do think that happens in all of them.
Yeah.
Jay,
Yeah. And I think there's something interesting. I think it's partly how we frame it, right? That like, oh, if you're hurt, it's okay to sit out, right? But I think there is something structural that is like the flip side to how empowering martial arts feels and being in the flow state. And it feels so different. It does, to me, it's like kind of magical and it feels so different from violence. And yet, also, I have done exactly what you're talking about. I have spent a lot of time, right, thinking about consent and vulnerability and limitations. And once I broke my foot and I kept rolling, and more recently I tore a tendon and I kept rolling. And it was like, I should know better. I should know better than that. But it's like it's partially because of that of the endorphins, right? And everything else that, is involved in um, making martial arts feel good. But then there's also, I think, part of what brings us into the flow state is like the mind partly thinks this is a survival situation. And again, I think this is so cool. I think this is magical. That like I've only done one jujitsu tournament, but like I was so fascinated by like my mind went into, in a way, total survival mode. There's like thousands of people yelling and shouting, and there's, 23 other matches going on. The world disappeared, and it was all me and that opponent. And yet, at the same time that my mind treated it as a survival situation, my mind also knew it was a sport and a game, and I had to follow the rules of the game. And I was like, that's incredible. I love that. And then also, there are risks to that, right? Like you can keep training through injury, you can like forget to tap and get put to sleep. Again, like weird euphemism that gets used there, right? But like so those things do happen, and like that's the complexity of it. That's what makes it interesting and maybe what calls out for nuance.
one thing I think about this differently now as a coach, because as an athlete and a competitor, I was very tough on myself, and I was very much like, you are not injured, you are hurt, you can push through this. And there's a fine line, right? I'm not saying that there's a one size fits all solution. There's certainly not for situations, but like especially when athletes are are willing to have the endorphins going, that have the adrenaline rush, and now they're not feeling that footlock that just happened or whatever it is. I view it like I'm much more likely to say an affirmative no to my folks and just be like, it's not your choice anymore. I have to take you out of this. And not because I don't believe in you, but because I don't want you to put yourself at any more risk. We had one student, shout out to Andy Bridge, who trained with a broken clavicle that we thought was a dislocated collarbone. Turned out they had cracked their sternum. And it was like,
My
and we're not talking like
word.
one training session. We're talking like weeks. I don't even know how long. And the human body is tough, and human beings are tough, and adrenaline and endorphins are hella drugs, which is part of what makes it magical. But magic's dangerous sometimes too, right?
Indeed.
Is that why they named
Yeah,
the school
well
Magic
said.
BJJ, Mike?
No, my friend who owns it is a big Magic the Gathering guy. So,
It's even better.
yeah. But, it's pretty magical. Anyway,
Jay, let's return to something you talked about earlier, which is empowerment, self-defense. And one of the things that you write about that's related to these topics is effective fear. And you wrote about how empowerment self defense, as well as probably other martial arts practices, but that's the one specifically that I'm thinking of, teaches us to confront denial, which is a common response to interpersonal violence. That interpersonal violence, we're often in denial about how serious it is, like real world violence. And that empowerment self defense, and like I think really good self defense training generally teaches us to overcome denial, to confront that part of ourselves, and to move forward even while we're acknowledging fear. And so I guess I have a two-part question. I can't help but think we can apply that to other parts of life. You wrote an essay about applying it to the climate crisis, to name one example. But also, like, what is it about that denial, that confrontation of denial that is common to the martial arts we've talked about? Or are there specific things that specific arts do better or differently than other arts do in terms of helping us get through that fear and denial?
Yeah. So the starting point with that idea comes from Gavin de Becker, who wrote The Gift of Fear. And I have to say, when I first started reading that book, I was kind of suspicious of it because I was like, wait, you're telling me I should be afraid? Tell me I should, yeah, I'm not afraid of anything. Um, and then I read it and I was like, oh, okay, he's actually not telling us that we should be afraid. He's telling us that it's part of being a human animal. It's part of being an animal generally to feel fear. And fear is a survival mechanism. And, he talks about denial and kind of how we can talk ourselves out of fear. And, he claims that that's only true of humans. We could maybe question that. Um, but then I got into thinking about like socially and politically, how are we kind of enculturated to deny fear? And I think as a society, we have this idea that fear is a sign of weakness. And like fear is in fact not weakness. And there's that old saying about like bravery isn't not being afraid, it's being afraid and moving ahead anyway. Um, but I think we get a lot of those messages that if we're brave, we don't feel fear. Um, and there's, fear is kind of gendered. So many of us raised as girls are taught we should be afraid of everything. And people raised as boys are often taught they shouldn't be afraid of anything. But the end result's actually the same, which is that our fear signals get mucked up and we can no longer tell when we're actually afraid and when we're not. And instead, we end up falling into sometimes into anxiety, which is like fear without a stimulus. And if we're fearful, but there's actually nothing to be afraid of, then we actually can't recognize like the real threat when it appears. So, as you say, I wrote about that in relation to the climate crisis, right? And I think part of it's astounding to me that our planet's life support system could be at risk, and we could just continue proceeding as if everything is business as usual. And I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but a lot of that has to do with normalization, right? Like we cue off of other people. And so in that situation, it's appropriate to be afraid. And it's appropriate to share that fear because people do look to other people to decide whether or not to act. And one of the things self-defense teaches us is that we can turn fear into anger very quickly if we need to. And it's very important to like protect that mechanism. More relevant for, the conversations you all have been having is also looking at the fascist turn in our society, and how denial is so prevalent. Oh, this is America. It can't happen here. Oh, it's not. Here are all the ways in which this is different from like 1930s fascism, all sorts of like justificatory frames and ideas that get bandied around without confronting the fundamental thing that like, well, this is a movement in a fascist direction and we should be afraid. And it's okay to be afraid and it's okay to express that to other people so that then instead of normalizing denial, we normalize action.
One of the
Um,
oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
oh, no,
Ye-
I think there was a second part to your question and I seem to have forgotten it. So,
It's all good. I
um,
probably, if it's
okay.
important, we'll come back to it. But like
Okay.
on the topic of fear, one of the coolest things Hickson Gracie ever did, and Hickson, universally regarded as one of the best ever. Mike may know what I'm talking about. And Jay, if you don't, I'll happily send this to you. But in the film Choke, Hickson talks about fear, and as some guys around him say they're not afraid of anything, and he said that's stupid, that's silly to me. Um, Fear is very closely related to intelligence. I'm afraid of everything. And this is maybe the greatest jiu-jitsu athlete ever, certainly he's on most people's short list saying that. And I think that's like a really powerful insight. It's, I think, related, right? That we can feel fear and it doesn't mean that that paralyzes action, or it shouldn't.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of situations in it in which it would be crazy to not feel a little bit afraid, right?
Right. Do you
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts on what we might do to help especially when it comes to that complacency around the rise of American fascism and that denial? Do you have any thoughts based on your work as to what we might do to help kind of jar people out of that? I read your essay on climate change a few times since Jeff sent it to me, and I'm curious as to how you might apply some of those strategies to fighting fascism in America.
Yeah, that is the $64,000 question, isn't
If
it?
you can solve it for us
Is like,
today,
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
no pressure, Jay, no
Okay, right,
pressure.
exactly. Yeah. Um, yeah, well, I think a big part of it is like if we to think about it in terms of self-defense, right? It's like the allowing ourselves to feel fear, um, mitigating anxiety, right? So trying to separate the signal and the noise. Um, and then I think also like in self-defense training, very often like there are sort of techniques for um mitigating the denial response. So the like, oh, I'm sure it's probably nothing. Oh, well, if I'm saying that, it means it's probably something, right? So oh, I'm sure he really didn't mean it that way, right? Like, okay, that's telling me actually that the opposite is probably the case. And so I think part of it might be about how we train ourselves, how we train ourselves as political subjects, how we train ourselves as um, people in a society that is moving rapidly in a very non-democratic direction, is to just recognize these things and say, this is not normal. Right. And I guess the other like the other thing that's related to self-defense is thinking about like how you recognize an abusive relationship, right? Because abusive relationships aren't what or how they're presented in media or what we think of necessarily, but like, and this has been talked about a lot, right? Like gaslighting and projection and all of that that we see coming from particular people in politics. And to just recognize that and say like, okay, that's gaslighting. Why are these people gaslighting? Why are they projecting? Right. So I mean, those are sort of individual strategies, but I think the more we can do that collectively, and then the more we can then think about saying, like, this is a cause for fear, and then how do we turn that fear into anger, and how do we turn that anger into action?
Right.
Yeah, well said. You've been writing about, like, Mike asked about fascism broadly, and you're one of the people that's been writing about the fascist trend in MMA for some time. And you first wrote an essay that talked about MMA's fascism problem several years ago. What inspired you to write that? What first inspired you to write that? And what has happened then since then, if anything has, to make you, do you think it's more of a problem now? I think most of us would think it is, but I'm curious about what your take on it is.
Yeah. So yeah, I started writing about this actually because there was an article in the Guardian about MMA and far right fight clubs. And I'd been hearing about this for a while. There were a lot of rumors flying around that like there are these far right white supremacist MMA people. Um, and then there was this article and I was like, okay, that's interesting that that's being brought to light. But I also was kind of disturbed that the journalist, his explanation was, well, it is the violent nature of MMA. And I was like, well, okay. So a variable can't explain a constant can't explain a variable, right? And so we have MMA far right fight clubs, but then we have like Sharice Davids, who's a grassroots progressive member of Congress, who's a pro MMA fighter. And then there's I think Xiaodong, who's a Chinese MMA fighter who switched from Sanda to MMA because he said MMA was all about democracy. And so I was like, okay, so you have like MMA representing like these three different political positions right there, just in those examples. So um, a constant can't explain a variable. And then also like there are other martial arts that engage in like, full contact, um, sparring or full contact fighting, that use more efficient means. So, why aren't they doing Shuto or boxing or full contact Filipino martial arts or Krav Maga? Well, I think there's a pretty clear explanation for why they're not doing those things. And it has less to do with how much contact there is and more to do with the ethnic and racial and national overtones, right? So I was like, I think this is a little more complicated. But then I also didn't want to just write a repost article, and I've been thinking about this idea for a while about agonistics, about the idea that contestation and struggle is inherent to democracy. It's Chantal Mouffe's political theory. And um and I'd also been thinking about American like non-combat sports. Particularly, I live right next to a public park, and there's a soccer pitch, and there was a sign for a while that was for ASO, and it said, "Remember, these players are children. This is not the World Cup. Referees are human." And I was like, What are we rehearsing here as a society? And this idea that like you have to win at all costs, and it doesn't matter how fairly you play. And then I was thinking about the idea that like, well, if you neglect sporting behavior, then you're saying that opposition is inherently invalid. And one of the things that's possibly beneficial about sports is that it celebrates opposition, and it celebrates opposition with consent and with the parameters of etiquette and in healthful engagement. And it suggests that opposition is valid, that winning and losing are temporary states. It can be very democratic when practiced with reflection. Right. And so I had been thinking about all that. And then I saw this article and I just sort of, I put them together, to sort of make this argument that there are so many things about not so much MMA as a sport, but like particularly professional level UFC and like the sort of the like gleeful abandonment of sporting behavior that I was like, this I find really disturbing. I find that way more disturbing than people just, kicking and punching each other with force. And I think that's what really sets us up for fascism. And, it's one of those things that at the time that I wrote it, I wasn't even thinking about the directions, how quickly as a society we were potentially heading um, in a fascistic direction.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that a constant can't determine a variable, and one of the variables that I heard there, and we talked about economics a little bit, right? Because the sport of MMA, as is practiced on the grassroots level throughout America and throughout the world, is not the same as the UFC, the professional fighting organization, which generates massive amount of capital for certain folks. In order to do that, maybe it has to, or it doesn't have to, it chooses to celebrate some things that are antisocial. And I also think the gender aspect of it is something that we don't talk about enough, vis-a-vis mixed martial arts, and that a lot of these, what we call active clubs, these white nationalist clubs, I think are trying to really masculinize something that for me should be accessible to all gender identities, and I think that's part of what they're kind of appealing to.
Totally. Yeah. So I guess the second part of your question was, has it gotten worse? You all are, I think, are the experts on that more than me, but I guess, I mean, clearly it has, right? But also one of the components of that is this sort of rise of oligarch masculinity through jujitsu, which
Hmm.
is
Ugh.
just so maddening because I think it so misses the point of
It's
what,
gross.
yeah, it's exactly, it's gross, it's excessive, it's hyperbolic, it's it says there's a like hyperbolic silliness of like almost like this kind of like hypothetical like, oh, in a fight like those kinds of like in a fight between Superman and Godzilla, who would win kind of level, that I just think is like preposterous in relation to like the reality of fight sports, where like when done with intelligence it really teaches us about one another's each other's vulnerabilities. Like we get to experience the vulnerability of somebody else's body, but also of our own. And the humbling aspect of it, I think, is one of the things that makes martial arts and particularly jujitsu so compelling.
I think if there's one good thing about the Derek Moneyberg fiasco, and Jay, I don't know if you've been following this, but very very wealthy guy, sort of internet scammer who makes a lot of money scamming people on the internet, evidently paid for a black belt that he earned in 3.5 years. And I think it's interesting because this has unified a lot of people that don't have a lot in common. Like a lot of folks that I don't have a lot in common with in the jiu-jitsu community are just as outraged about this as I am. And for me, that's coalesced the idea. As a person that grew up working class, I've never understood why people who have worked and earned things do not see the ownership of rich people just coming in and buying everything that you've worked for as the most horrific thing of all time. And I think if there is a good thing about this Derek Moneyberg thing, because someone like, I think that's a little bit different than someone like Mark Zuckerberg or someone like Slater from Saved by the Bell, or these people who are celebrities and wealthy and have access to more resources and can pay the best trainers in the world, because Zuckerberg learns from Dave Camarillo, who's amazing. And of course he can train with whoever he wants. And so that person's always going to have access to more resources. For me, that's qualitatively different because those dudes actually train. And there are other sort of justice related issues associated with that. But I think the Moneyberg fiasco has any positive outcomes, it may be that people see like, hey, rich people shouldn't be able to just come in and buy everything. Not everything's a commodity.
I would hope so. And I think you're right that potentially it does open up some of these questions, right? And I totally agree with you. I also grew up working class, and I am so puzzled by how like billionaires have convinced the working classes that they represent the interest of the people. Um, it's mind-boggling, right? And the whole thing about we're the job creators when like no, in fact, they're just making money by moving money. Like they're actually not creating jobs, like in a literal sense. Um, that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think maybe what is like what the part of it that I think is interesting too is like, yes, I agree with you that just sort of buying a black belt isn't the same thing as training for it, even if you can pay for the best trainers. And then I think there is also though something about like the Mark Zuckerberg side of it that maybe shows us that sport is not as fair as we think it is, right? We tend to really hold up this idea that sports are meritocracies. Um, and, a big part of sports is like how much training you have access to, right? And I think that, that's not necessarily something that's going to shift easily, but I think just acknowledging that is important.
Yeah. I had this conversation with somebody recently about the fairness of sport. I'm headed off to Vegas in a couple days to compete in Master Worlds. And I've done that for the past several years in a row as a older black belt, right? And there's no way those divisions are fair. Like, I'm not complaining about it, but I guarantee you probably half the people in my division are on steroids, right? I guarantee you a lot of the people in my division have the access, the money and the ability to travel and compete way more than I do. I'm a social worker in Michigan, right? That kind of limits, I have kids, one just moved out of the house, a 17-year-old at home. Like, I don't get to compete at this high of a level consistently, right? And that matters, right? So, and plus the black belt division is super deep. So I've been a black belt for 7-ish years. I could come up against somebody who's been a black belt for 15, right? 20. So none of that is inherently fair or equal. And I feel like we have to kind of recognize that if we're going to participate in any sport, and realize that there's often not a lot we can do about it. We just have to do it for the love of it anyway, right?
Well, my take on fairness is twofold. I think it depends on your social position, whether you look at it as an individual or you look at it from a group setting. And this is how, because nothing in life is truly fair. And we can try and make it more fair, but nothing in life is truly fair. If you are a competitor, and when I talk to my competitors who say things like it's not fair, I always say, we have to be so much better. Fair doesn't matter. And as an individual, that's how you get better. It's how you say, I don't care about the obstacles that are in my path, the gender discrimination, the race discrimination, access to resources. I am going to be the best Jay, the best Jeff, the best Mike. I'm going to do my best to improve myself so much that fairness doesn't matter. That's the mentality that you have to have as an individual. Now, from a systems perspective, if no one is paying attention to fairness in the system, then the system fails and the system breaks down. And I think that the two have to work hand in hand, because if the system becomes too unfair, and you can analogize this to other systems like the economic systems too, what happens at the end of a game of Monopoly? One person has all the money and the world ceases to function. And so systems, and this is what I say to my friends who are just on the grind as like, no, we just got to work hard and make more money, is the same I say to the competitors. Like, yeah, do your best, be as good as you can be, but also recognize if no one is paying attention to the system, eventually the system fails. And when the system fails, everyone fails with it.
Right. I'm with you. As an individual going into this competition, whatever, I'm just going to be the best Mike that I can be. But as a human being, as part of a system, I don't believe that I'm going to work my social work job and end up and, as rich as Elon Musk or Zuckerberg, right? Like, I know that's not
He doesn't look
going to
as good in a
happen.
tank top as you do, though.
Oh,
So,
Elon, no way.
not a chance.
But so we've talked about fascism in MMA. Is there anything else you want to say in that topic, Jay, that we haven't hit on? I wanted to take us out of me complaining about Master Worlds not being fair.
Right.
If I could direct that question just a little, because I'm curious about this. You talk a lot about play and the specific type of play we didn't do in combat sports. One of the things that the ideas I got reading some of your work is that martial arts is creative, right? And lots of different people from tons of different communities engage in this creative play. Is there a blueprint there for us to combat things like authoritarianism, like these types of oppressions, and and I'll just leave it there. That's my question to you.
Well, yeah, that's another $64,000 question right there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess if it, would that I had a blueprint. But I do think there's something very interesting about how we frame martial arts and how we frame the framing of martial arts. Um, so you had someone on a few weeks ago who talked about how fascism needs the subhuman and the superhuman, right? And I guess to go back to the question about MMA or jiu-jitsu and fascism, right? One of the things around that oligarch masculinity that's so annoying are these sort of hyperbolic kind of statements about like jujitsu is the only martial art that works. And, when you tap somebody out, it's a symbolic death. And um, part of that like does contribute to this creation of like the superhuman, you know. Um, Sometimes you'll hear in martial arts, not so much in jujitsu, but like this thing about like, well, we're the guardians for the normal people, right? And like you have the wolves and the sheep and the sheepdogs, right? And we're the sheepdogs and the normal people are the sheep. And that's all that stuff like really contributes to that idea of like the superhuman. Um, and maybe it would be helpful if we just didn't take ourselves so damn seriously. Like it's just a sport. It's just a game. It's really cool and really interesting to try to get as good at it as possible. Um, and also just a game isn't just really a just because like, I mean, I wrote a whole book about play. Obviously, I think it's something to like, to be paradoxical about it, to take it seriously. Like, and I think that's actually where the beauty of it is that like maybe framing it not so much as like we're superhuman, not that people use those terms exactly, but like we're the badasses, we're the tough people. Like that can contribute to this thing that you also get in team sports where the sort of camaraderie and goodwill only exists within the team and everyone else is someone to be bullied or belittled, right? And instead, if we frame this as like, we're practicing this sport, this activity to raise each other up, but we're also like, we're practicing respect. And we're practicing respect in situations that are really tense and intense. And we're practicing respect even in combative situations. So if we can be respectful and we can treat each other with civility, even in combative situations, can we maybe take that off the mat? Right? And can we extend that out to our community more generally and welcome other people, even if other people don't want to practice martial arts? Can we welcome other people into that idea?
I was on a show, Jay, last year, another podcast, and as a guest, and I said something about, you know, why we don't need to take ourselves so seriously in jiu-jitsu. We're grown people wearing pajamas and spandex and wrestling each other, right? And the comments on the YouTube portion of that show, so many comments about, how dare you disrespect my art, and blah blah blah, and very much like some people did not like being reminded that doing this activity doesn't make us superior to anybody else, right? Any more than music or sculpture or basket weaving or crochet, right? It doesn't.
Yeah.
So I find that take fascinating.
And isn't it, and I think it's indicative, right? It's like that thing with denial, right? The fact that I'm saying, oh, it's probably nothing tells me it's probably something. And if like you or I say like, hey, can we just take ourselves a little less seriously, and people freak out, then it's like, okay, people are investing a lot of their identity into something here. That's something about like this, and it's not just true of jujitsu people. I think there's this idea that risk play is intrinsically but worthwhile, and by like engaging in intense risk, we're like accomplishing something in the world. And in reality, we're not. We're just doing because it's fun, or we're trying to build our skills,
Hmm.
right? But like it can push people to question their own identities, I think, to question that idea.
So I think it's on jujitsu coaches to lead the culture shift. And
Mhm.
because, I was, and I'm not entirely sure. I think we shouldn't take ourselves as seriously. I do think we should. I'm an irreverent person. I talk about pajama wrestling and swimwear violence all the time in the academy. Even though we take our jujitsu very seriously, we just don't take ourselves very seriously. And so it is a paradox in that people do put a lot of themselves into this. I know I do. And jujitsu is as close to something sacred as exists in my life, which doesn't necessarily mean I take it seriously. Like I said, it's a paradox. But when I say culture shift, um, what I mean is that every society has a hero system. And in America, ours is very individualistic, right? We have the great man, and it's always a man theory of history. We have these Ubermensch versus other folks sort of thing, where it's the great person that rises above, that strives with great endeavor. And a thing that I try to push all the time is that no one of us is as smart as all of us, and that nobody ever does anything worth doing alone, ever, period. And I think that if we internalize that a little more, not just that, like, we can all do to be a little bit more irreverent, but the idea that the greatest athlete in our academy who gets on the podium at Adult Worlds, the lowest ranked white belt helped that person, because even if they never trained together, and they probably did at my academy, even if they never trained together, we're all building an environment, and that environment creates all of us. And it can create, when I say it creates all of us, it can either create a great group of us or not, and that's the choice that we have. Uh, there's a guy named Ernest Becker who wrote one of my favorite books, The Denial of Death. He talks about the hero system a lot, and about how we all define how heroes exist, and there are common stories throughout human history and different cultures about how we know the narrative that we are told, who the hero is, and how we know that person is the hero. And I think as jujitsu coaches, we have to redefine the hero, and that like the hero is not the shining face on the top of the podium all the time. Sometimes the hero is the person that contributed to that person's travel fund. Sometimes the hero is the person that stopped somebody who would have injured that person from getting on the mat in a way that wasn't productive. And that's all of us. That's all of us. No one of us is as smart as all of us. No one of us is as strong as all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important distinction to talk about how seriously we take ourselves versus how seriously we take our art, right? Like, I think we can recognize that these practices that we dedicate ourselves to, like, the practice is bigger than all of us. And that's partially why we should take it seriously and why we should take ourselves less seriously. I think, that the art is like is the collective creation of the insights and the brilliance of all these people who have worked on it and continue to work on it. And that's the people whose pictures are in the academies, the people who are the progenitors of the form and the lead professors, but it's also everybody else, right? Everyone who's practicing, everyone who's training, everyone who shows up, even though they've had a long day, uh, everyone who's putting in the effort. And that sort of like building the story of the collective is partly how we shift away from this excessive emphasis on individualism. So maybe that answers your question of the blueprint for combating authoritarianism.
Jay, do you know whose picture hangs on the wall of my academy? Mike, is that why you were smiling?
Exactly.
J-
Yeah, yeah.
It's Patrick Swayze dressed as a Russian general. Because, so
Awesome.
yeah,
So good.
so obviously I don't fully disagree with we shouldn't take ourselves more seriously. So
Awesome.
so I know you have another engagement. You've been super generous with our time. I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts for us, anything I haven't asked about that you wish I would have asked about, or anything that you think me, Mike, or anybody listening out at home should know.
Well, I guess we didn't really talk that much about specifically what makes martial arts play. And so maybe just briefly,
Go
I can
for it,
outline a
please.
few things.
I'd love that.
I, I have this nice microphone set up and I keep hitting the microphone because I'm gesturing so broadly. I'm kind of undercutting the need for the nice microphone. So a few things that I think, because I think it's a little bit counterintuitive to talk about martial arts as play, particularly combat sport and modern hybrid martial arts. So a few things that I think are really useful to consider in relation to martial arts. One is, we've talked about this in detail, play is consensual. And if you're not consenting, you're not playing. People use terms like dark play and edge play for trickery, but I think that's a problematic use of the term play. Um, Play is intrinsically valuable. And I think this can be really helpful with getting out of that hero mindset sometimes. Um, that just the practice of doing it, that's why we do it. We do it to do it. Um, and all these other things, yes, going to the tournaments, yes, getting the belts, like all of those things, they're also valuable, but really we wouldn't keep doing it if doing it was not intrinsically valuable. Um, One of the things I love about play is that is how it works on a meta communicative level. And here I'm drawing from Gregory Bateson, who's an anthropologist, like sort of mid 20th century anthropologist. And he talks about how um, movement has the capacity for communication in it. He talks about dogs and play. And he talks about how play is a form of meta communication because it contains a message, but the message is about the message. So in other words, like when a dog nips another dog in play, that the nip denotes the bite, but it doesn't mean what the bite would mean. And I love that idea. It like every time I see my dogs playing, every time I bring them to the dog park, I'm always fascinated by that. And then I'm also fascinated by how in martial arts, um, that idea is so important that actually the meaning is inverted of normal action. So in regular life, if I were to choke you out, not that I'm going to be able to do that because you're a black belt, so good luck, but if I did, I'd be trying to
You would.
exterminate your will, right? Whereas if that happened on the mat, actually, and you are a black belt, and it would be like, wow, good job, Jay. I'm so proud of you.
Mhm.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
and so it has like the opposite meaning. And indeed, if we were rolling and you didn't choke me out, I'd be like, oh, come on, Jeff, or come on, Mike. Like, what, like, you think I'm not worth it? Like, I'm not worth you even putting that much effort. Right. So it's like this opposite meaning. And then also the other thing is that the other thing Gregory Bateson talks about is framing and how there are framing gestures. So like with dogs, it's the play bow, right? And that idea that everything that happens after this is play. And again, I'm fascinated by that because of the idea of etiquette. And things like, slapping hands and bumping fists, that like, okay, everything that happens after this is a game. Um, and then the final thing about play that I think is really important and ties back to all this discussion about fascism and about politics is the idea that rules make the game. So games use intentionally inefficient means. That's what makes them games. And also, we follow the rules in a game because that's what the game is. And I think that's really important for thinking about politics because there's really been this abandonment of rules. And, I'm not somebody who thinks that we should follow rules blindly in all sorts of situations, but it really disturbs me in the case of democracy because democracy is largely built around a goodwill assumption that people are going to follow the rules.
Oh, that's perfectly said. And like, if you heard that and you want to know more, a lot of that is in Jay's book, which I found really excellent. I would love to have you back on sometime where we could just talk about play because I got a lot of ideas about jujitsu and how that sort of meta communication of movement manifests itself and the different messages we send from role to role, from action to action.
Yeah, yeah. I would love to. I would love to talk more about play in detail.
Mike,
This
any
has been fascinating, Jay. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting conversation.
I'm so glad to hear it. We'd love to do it again. If I don't know if you're a person that wants folks to follow you on social media or buy your books or things of that nature, but if folks are interested in learning more, how can they learn more about your work?
So, I would love for people to read my books and articles and to generate ideas and discussion and conversation from them. I'm not a big social media user, so the best way to find my publications and some of my thoughts is to go to my website. It's really old fashioned, but I mean, it's under my full name, which is janetochet.com. Um, I do have an Instagram account, but I hardly ever use it. It's J O'Shea, but there's not really much of anything there. Yeah, so the website would be the place to go.
We'll put a link to your website, especially the publications page in the show notes. Mike, how can folks get a hold of you?
Can find me online at Instagram at Old Bastard BJJ. That's probably the most reliable way to get a hold of me. There's also my email, oldbastardbjj@gmail.com, if you have any questions or want to hit me up for any seminars or anything like that. But Instagram is the most reliable way.
Unlike my dear friends and colleagues, I am perpetually online and will respond to you within 30 seconds at Jeff Shaw BJJ on Instagram. It's embarrassing and I'm trying to stop that. And I'm not doing that for the next 3 weeks because I'm going to be in Japan. But I know it's going to be epic. It's going to be epic. I'm going to try to turn off my phone or throw it into the sea of Japan, but we'll see what happens with that.
You better not throw it in the sea because we want pictures when we get back.
But it'll all be in my mind, Mike. We'll do some meta communication when you come out here and we roll.
All right, I'm in. I'm into that.
Jay, thanks again so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.